Sermon on the Mount. I hope you remember that. The word blessed was used again and again. We discussed our common use of the word and found that for Jesus, blessed took on a much greater, a much deeper, a more broad meaning. Being blessed, as Jesus sees it, is when times are good and you're sharing it in conversation with God. Being blessed, to Jesus, as he sees it, is when times are bad and you're sharing it with God. For Jesus, it wasn't the times that determined blessing. Instead, it was in sharing with God, no matter good or bad, the conversation was the blessing. Now this week I heard or read somewhere something that really sort of shook me and made sense to me at the same time. Someone was describing the experience or the difference between people who are associated with being religious conservatives or evangelicals and their liberal or mainstream counterparts. What's the difference? Well, the evangelicals generally believe that they need God in their mission to change the world. And that person said, well, the liberal mainstream folk, they generally believe that God needs them in their mission to change the world. It's a significant difference. Now, there is a middle. It's real and it's a useful ground. It's useful because it can be a very powerful coalition. There are dangers to each extreme. For the very conservative, the problem exists when they don't do anything about a serious social issue because they're waiting for God to produce the miracle. And for the liberal, the problem exists when they dive into any number of situations or solutions without taking time to consider unintended consequences. Jesus is led to the wilderness by the Spirit, where he is tempted again and again. First with food, in a nod to our temptations of the body, and then he's tempted with power, in a nod to vanity or greed contained within our thought or within our heart. We see conversation between Jesus and the tempter, but what we don't see is Jesus being in conversation with God. But I'm willing to bet that temptations that Jesus felt were strong, and they were the feelings of anxiety and desire that you and I feel on a daily basis. So for his relief, he didn't enter into a string of action items to resolve his dilemma. What did Jesus most likely do? He prayed. He opened himself to blessing. He had a conversation with God. We don't read it, but I'm willing to bet. He was there for 40 days and 40 nights. There had to have been some time for prayer in there, don't you think? He expressed his need for God rather than going off and solving the problem all on his own. Now, I admit, prayer can seem like an open-ended conversation, one where a question is asked, but an answer is never spoken in return. For some of us, prayer seems elusive, as we never know what we're going to say. And for others, there seems to be a frustration in never hearing anything in return. But I want you to remember something. Nowhere do we ever see Jesus ever hearing a direct answer to one of his prayers to God. We never see this conversation happening where God is speaking to Jesus orally, like Moses going to the burning bush. We never see it. we do read that God speaks to Jesus in moments of God's choosing. So God does speak to Jesus, but God chooses those moments. But never does God enter into a dialogue with Jesus. Jesus prays, God listens. Now, prayer, it doesn't have to be fancy, nor does it have to be structured in any certain way. All prayer needs to be is from the depth of your best self. If you want a deeper prayer life, all you need to do is to start out with the prayers that you already know. Now, every Sunday morning worship, we recite 3 prayers that you all know by heart. We do the Lord's Prayer together. We sing the Gloria Patri, and we sing the doxology. All 3 very fancy prayers, by the way. You already know 3 very complicated and very important prayers. You're all fancier than you might have realized. Those are good starts. Now, in the end, though, what really matters is that you remain in conversation and that you not reserve your words for emergencies. More than likely, you'll be tongue-tied during an emergency anyhow. Now, there's a wonderful movie from the 1970s. Perhaps you remember it. The movie was Oh God, starring George Burns and John Denver. Now, throughout the whole movie, John Denver's character, I remembered his name all of a sudden. His name was Jerry, I think. He receives visits and divine assistance from and is in regular conversation with God. There is a conversation going on. God, of course, is played by George Burns. In the end, John Denver has lost his job, and he is seen as a Bible thumper by his friends and his neighbors. He has to move on in a world where he knows intimately that God does exist. In the same world, though, where others doubt or deny. And in a tender ending to the movie, God is bidding Jerry goodbye. And Jerry, John Denver, asks him, "Well, will I see you again? Can we talk from time to time?" And God just sweetly reaches up and touches Jerry on the chin. He says, "You talk, I'll listen." And so it is with you and with me. If we'll talk, God will listen. Let's all need God a little more. What do you say? Good times? Bad times? Let's just reach out. God will be there to answer and to love. Would you stand if you're able as we sing 40 Days and 40 Nights in the black hymnal number